Tonight's topic is Kitniyot, but not just Kitniyot. Kitniyot in terms of beyond the thing itself, the question of whether one can or cannot, should or should not eat Kitniyot on Pesach. There is a further aspect to this discussion, that is, how does this impact, or how does this minhag impact our Judaism in general? That we'll discuss in the second half. The first half we'll just look at some of the basic sources. All right, so without further ado, source number one is from the Mishnah in Masechet Pesachim on Daf Lamed Hey, and the Talmud on that Mishnah. The Mishnah states, "Elu devarim sh'adam yoseh bahem yodeh chovato b'Pesach." These are the types of grain with which one can perform one's obligation of eating Matzah on the night of Pesach, Leil HaSeder. In other words, you have to make Matzah from certain substances, certain grains. It cannot be made from just anything. We'll explain in a moment. What are those things mentioned here in the Mishnah? Bahitim, uvaseorim, uvachusmin, uvashibol shu'al, uvashifon. Those are the five grains mentioned here in the Mishnah. And therefore the term is well known to most of us, I imagine. They're known as Hamishat Haminim, the five species of grain. Having said that, the question of course becomes, what are these five species? Is it as simple as it sounds? Well, Hitim means wheat, we know that. Hita is wheat, Hitim means wheat, Se'orim means barley, Kusmin, well, we'll get to that in a moment. Shiboleth Shu'al is even more complicated, and Shifon. The problem at the very outset is that we have to understand that not all the terms that we use today in Hebrew are necessarily identical with the same term. They don't refer to the same item, the same type of grain, the same species, as was intended when they were used by Chazal in the Mishnah. So when it comes to Hita, wheat, no question. Hita is wheat, no argument about that. There are many, many types, there are many varieties of wheat, but there are many varieties of wheat, as there are a number of varieties of barley, but the word Hita includes all types of wheat. And the word Se'orim includes all types of barley. So if you take wheat grains, barley grains, grind them into flour, mix them with water, add a little salt, which is perhaps sounds unusual or like a chidush to you, but that's what I do, and I can talk about that more if you like. And you make yourself some matzah, it's fine. You can eat that matzah Leil HaSeder and make the mitzvah of eating a kazayit of matzah Leil HaSeder. Of course, if you like matzah, you can eat matzah all night long, and you can eat matzah all 7 days to your heart's content. And those who don't like matzah, for whatever reason, do not have to eat matzah more than that first night. Okay? Now, we covered now 2 out of the 5 grains. What's the third one mentioned here? Kusmin. Kusmin, mentioned in the Mishnah, is generally understood to be spelt, which is either true or not true, but it doesn't really matter, because the Rambam states that the 5 species of grain that are mentioned here are actually 3 species of wheat, 3 varieties of wheat, and 2 varieties of barley. So whether kusmin is one of the 2 varieties of barley or one of the 3 varieties of wheat mentioned in the Mishnah, it doesn't really matter right now. The fact is, from what we do know, it is one of the types of wheat, one of the varieties of wheat, and it's what we refer to as spelt. Thus, so far so good. The last 2 mentioned in the Mishnah are Shiboleth Shu'al and Shifon. Correct? Now, Shiboleth Shu'al, what does that mean nowadays? If you go to the store in Israel today and you ask for Shiboleth Shu'al, what will they give you? Kvaker, what most Israelis often refer to as kvaker, which means oats. Kvaker is Quaker. For whatever reason, they think that the only kind of oats are the ones that come in a little bag that says Quaker on the front with the guy with that hat. But no, that's not, in actual fact, what it means. Although, to be fair, to be more precise, according to Rashi, that is what it means. According to Rashi, the Shibolet Shu'al mentioned here in the Mishnah does refer to oats. So according to that, according to Rashi, if you take oats, grind them into flour, mix them with water, try and make matzah out of it, it's okay, it's kasher, it's fine, you can do that. The problem, however, is that it doesn't work. It can't be done. because practically speaking, it cannot be done, because if you grind up oatmeal into even very finely and mix it with water, you will not get any kind of a dough. It just doesn't hold together as a dough. That's just the fact of the matter. If you ask me, did Rashi not try it? Did he not discover this? I cannot answer. I cannot speak for Rabbeinu Shlomo Zichron Livracha. I cannot tell you. I just know that that's the fact. You cannot make a dough from oat flour mixed with water. The reason for that is very simple. There is no gluten in oats.
It does have a gluten, but it's not.
In its natural form, it doesn't have any gluten. What it does happens is that in the packaging and processing in plants, etc., it comes into contact with other things in the factory, and there are trace amounts of gluten sometimes, which people who are very sensitive to gluten cannot handle. That's true, but oats in and of themselves have either zero gluten or close to zero gluten.
It doesn't have wheat gluten, but it has its own kind of gluten, and I have celiac and I can't eat it.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's something which, if a person,
even if it's the wheat-free, completely isolated.
Oh, okay, all right. So I hear what you're saying, but it's not the kind of gluten that allows you to create a dough, because gluten, the word glue, of course, and gluten are related. The reason that gluten allows you to create a dough is because it's sticky, it's gluey, and once it comes into contact with water, the gluten within the wheat forms this mesh of gluten. It's like a mesh, it's like a net which traps. It's sticky and gluey and stretchy, and it traps the gases that are produced within the dough as part of the fermentation process, and that's why it begins to rise, because the gases do not escape. They're trapped inside, so it begins to expand. This does not happen with oats. Try as hard as you like, it will not happen with oats. Nor will it happen, for example, with rice. If you take rice and grind it into flour and mix it with water, you will not get anything resembling a wheat or even a barley based dough. Although barley based dough also is very poor in gluten, because there's much less gluten in barley, which is why barley bread, or barley in general, was always the poor man's grain in ancient times. Maybe even till relatively recent times. In Sefer Malachim, we see that the price of wheat was double the price of barley. At the end of a siege, the price of wheat was twice that of barley, because barley was only fed to animals or to the very, very poor people who couldn't afford the wheat. And if you do make bread from barley, then you end up with a very crumbly bread which doesn't hold together. As soon as you slice it or touch it, it begins to crumble and to come apart, because the gluten content is low. All right? So, according to Rashi, oats are shibolet shu'al. The problem is, A, you cannot really make a dough out of it. B, it cannot therefore become, there's no gluten to speak of anyhow, so it doesn't become hametz. Gluten and hametz go together. Without gluten, there's no hametz. That's why rice is not hametz, okay? And third of all, from what we know, and this is based on the expert opinion of botanists and archaeologists, etc., oats were not grown as a crop in Eretz Yisrael in ancient times. In fact, it's not grown as a crop nowadays either. It's all imported. So, having said that, so what is shibolet shu'al? Shibolet shu'al, according to many experts in the field, such as Professor, what was his name? Yehuda Felix, Zichron Livracha. He was a great expert in botany and fauna and flora of Eretz Yisrael and those things mentioned in the Tanakh and in the Mishnah. And he wrote books about this. According to him and many other experts, Shibolet Shu'al is not oats. It's one of those subspecies, one of those varieties, either of wheat or of barley. Apparently one of the barley types of barley. And that leaves us with chiffon. Chiffon nowadays, in Israel today, it's understood to refer to rye. It's also very dubious whether this is in fact what Chazal had in mind when they used the word chiffon. Again, from what we know, rye is not a grain that was grown in this part of the world at all, on any scale. It's a grain which requires a lot of moisture. It survives also in climates where there's lots of moisture and where it's very cold. That's why it's popular in Eastern Europe and Northwestern Europe. And therefore, chiffon is also apparently another variety of wheat, but not, or barley, but it's not the rye that we refer to today. However, because I am aware of the fact that in what we refer to as rye, in English it's rye, and in Hebrew it's also nowadays referred to, chiffon refers to that. In that grain there is gluten. Not quite as much as in regular wheat, but there is gluten. A significant amount, enough to make a dough and enough for it to rise and to become chametz. So really, according to that, in my view today, there are not 5, but there are 6 types of grain with which we are familiar that we can obtain that actually can become chametz. But the Mishnah speaks about these 5 grains. Now, it goes on to say, on the second line, number 1, Hane, these types mentioned, these varieties mentioned in the Mishnah, N, yes, these can become chametz, and therefore you can make matzah from them. Orez v'dohan, la, but rice and millet, which are not mentioned in the Mishnah, they are not included in those species, those types of grain that you can make into matzah and perform the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach. And on what is this based? Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish v'chen tanad dever Rabbi Ishmael v'chen tanad dever Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. It was taught in a number of Batei Midrash as follows. The pasuk says, "Lo tochal alo hametz, shiv'at yomim tochal alo masoth." The pasuk refers to hametz and matzah in the same breath. And it goes on to say, "Devarim habaim lidei himus adam yoseh bahen yodeh hovato b'matzah." Those grains that can become chametz, it's those things with which you can perform the mitzvah of eating matzah. In other words, it's a bit of a it's somewhat non-intuitive. In other words, you would think if you're trying to avoid a kind of bread, an unleavened bread that is not chametz, the best thing would be to take one of those varieties of grain or something similar to grain like rice that cannot become chametz at all and make matzah from that. That would be your best and safest path, correct? But no, matzah has to be made from those grains that can become chametz, but you made it in such a way that it did not become chametz. That's the whole idea of matzah. Matzah is something that could have become chametz, and you made sure that it did not. But if you make it from something that can never become chametz, then it's not matzah. That's what it says here in the Gemara. And that is why we do not make matzah and cannot make matzah from rice, from, as we said here, dohan, millet. In my view, you cannot make matzah from oatmeal, because it's not one of the grains mentioned in the Mishnah here either, and it doesn't rise, it doesn't become chametz. That's, as I said, Rashi wouldn't agree, but Rambam, that's what Rambam says, and that's what much information that we have at our disposal indicates that would be the correct approach. You cannot make it from any kind of legume or any kind of item that can be dried and ground into a kind of flour. The same goes, of course, for potato starch or what have you. You can buy today in Israel on Pesach, you can buy these things that look like bread rolls, but they're actually made of potato starch. All these things you cannot make matzah from because they can never become chametz. Okay, so we just have to understand the concept. The concept is matzah is bread that didn't become bread or didn't become leavened bread. It could have, had you allowed it to lie around, sit around for a long time, etc. But you made it in a certain way so that it could not become chametz. That is called matzah, and that's what you have to eat on Pesach. So, what did we just understand there from this statement in the Talmud? That rice, millet, and all similar substances are not kasher in terms of making matzah. And that's what we find later, a few lines down in the source before you, number 1. There was one Tana, Rabbi Yohanan ben Nuri, you'll see this the second to last line, who said, Orez min daranhu. In his view, orez was a kind of grain, and in his view, you can make matzah from rice. But his opinion is rejected by all the other chachamim of his generation and subsequent generations. It says in the last Perek Arvei Pesachim of Masechet Pesachim in the Talmud Bavli, Lethman dahash Rabbi Yohanan ben Nuri. There is no one who takes into account that opinion of Rabbi Yohanan ben Nuri regarding rice, etc. So the halacha is, and this is what you find in all the halachic sources, that only these specific varieties and these grains specifically can become hametz and therefore also kasher and can be used to make matzah. And therefore we have something of a conundrum before us, because if we know that there is a minhag, a custom, amongst some of the Jewish people, namely the Ashkenazim, not to eat kitniyot, which includes rice and millet, and it also includes beans and what have you, on Pesach, you must ask yourself, why not? Where did this come from? Because it actually contradicts what we just learned here. It's not what the Mishnah states. It's not what the Talmud states. How can this be? We'll try and explain this and answer that question as we proceed. The first thing to note is that this minhag amongst the Ashkenazim is fairly recent. When I say fairly recent, I don't mean it began a week ago or 100 years ago, but it also didn't begin 1,000 years ago, which in our terms, in the Jewish people's historical perspective, there's not a very long time. When did it begin to take hold in most Ashkenazi communities? Apparently, only in the 15th century. And the reason I know this will become apparent as we delve deeper into these sources. Because source number 2 before you is from the Rosh. Rabbeinu Asher, the Rosh, one of the most famous and greatest of the Rishonim, was a thoroughbred Ashkenazi. He was born in Ashkenaz, he was born in Germany. It's true that when he was apparently in his 50s or something like that, he had to flee Ashkenaz, Germany, because he was about to be arrested by the local thug who called himself an earl or a count or whatever it was, in order to extort from the Jewish community a huge ransom for his release, which is exactly what they did to his Rav, Rabbeinu Maharami Rothenburg. That happened to his Rav, and he understood that he had to do everything in his power to ensure that it did not happen to him. So when he understood that this was about to happen, he literally left in the middle of the night with his family, and they fled, and they ended up in Spain. And that's also a very interesting event for other reasons. Historically, it brought the learning of Ashkenaz to Sfarad, the way of understanding the Talmud and Halacha that was current in Ashkenaz and Tzarfat, in Germany and France. It brought that to Spain, because the Rosh was very highly regarded by the Jews of Spain. They honored him exceedingly when he arrived in Spain, and he became, within a short space of time, he was considered the leading chacham in all of Spain, even though he was a pure Ashkenazi, which is very unusual. That's why it's a significant event. And that's also why his son, the Tur, Rabbeinu Yaakov, who wrote the book called as the Tur, also you find in the Tur a kind of balance and a breadth of perspective that you do not see in many other halachic texts from that time. Because the Tur, his son, Rabbeinu Yaakov, the son of the Rosh, fled with his family, with his father, from Germany to Spain. He was apparently around 20 at that time. And he spent most of his life in Spain, till into his 70s. So he knew the Ashkenazi world very well, but he also knew the Sephardi world very well. When I say Sepharad, I mean Spain. Okay, not North Africa. He didn't know North Africa, but he knew Spain. And there were many differences between them in various areas of halacha, minhag, what have you. And this broadened his horizons, both the Rosh and even more particularly the Tur. So the Tur often quotes in his book, which became a standard book of halacha also for this reason, because it was something that both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim could relate to. It wasn't like the earlier texts, which were written from a purely Sephardi perspective or a purely Ashkenazi perspective. So if you were came from the wrong country, the wrong part of the world, so to speak, it didn't really speak to you, because it said, well, this is what we do, and in fact you look outside, you go to shul, and you see that's not what we do something else. So this book doesn't really help you, or it doesn't fit. The Tur was written with all these various communities in mind, so it's a much more balanced and broadly based halachic handbook, and that's why it became the perhaps the most authoritative and ubiquitous halachic text in the Jewish world. And that's why the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, wrote his Perush on the Tur, and having done that, then he wrote his Shulchan Aruch, etc., etc. So it's based on this fact that the Tur brought all these different opinions together in his book, which was the really the first attempt to give room both to the school of Chachamim, those who came from from France and Germany, like Rashi and the Tosafot, Marami Rothenburg, Rabbenu Tam, Riba la Tosafot, and those Chachamim in Spain, people like the Rif and the Rambam and the Rama with a Hey, not with an Aleph, and the Rashba, etc. Okay, that's some brief background. So what you would expect, if the Rosh is an Ashkenazi, which he is, that he would tell you, well, we don't eat rice on Pesach, right? But in fact, he tells you the opposite. In number 2, you will see what he says. He quotes the Talmud, and I'm not going to read all of that again. I'm going to go to the end of the 3rd line, in number 2. He says, the halacha is not like Rabbi Yohanan ben Nuri, the Oser Be'orez V'Dohan, who is of the opinion that rice and millet are also can also become chametz, and therefore they can also be used for matzah. D'chol davar she'en mechameshet haminim, anything which is, thank you. D'chol davar she'en mechameshet haminim, anything which is not of those 5 species mentioned in the Mishnah, en ba lideh himus, cannot become chametz. That's the halacha. And then he adds 5 very important words. Umutar la'asoth mimenu tavshil b'Pesach, and you're allowed to cook it on Pesach, referring to rice or millet or something like that. So the Rosh tells you explicitly you're allowed to cook rice on Pesach. Why did the Rosh go out of his way to write this? He just told you that halacha is not like Rabbi Yohanan ben Nuri, so he holds that rice can also become chametz. The halacha is not like him, so the rest you understand without it all being spelled out for you. The Rosh, I think, deliberately added these words to tell you, if you have heard about this minhag that some people have, not to eat things like rice on Pesach, well, I'm telling you, don't take any note of that minhag. And therefore he writes, Mutar la'asot mimenu tavshil b'Pesach. You're allowed to cook rice on Pesach. And this is even more obvious when you read the words of his son in the Tur, which is source number 3 before you, Rabbeinu Yaakov, the son of the Rosh. He also quotes the Mishnah, Elu devarim she'yotzeim bahem yadei chovat Matzah. These are the types of grain with which one can perform the mitzvah of Matzah. B'chitim u'v'se'orim u'v'chusmin u'v'shibolet shu'al u'v'shifon. Aval, but no, not lo be'orez u'shar minim, but not rice or other similar varieties. V'gam enon ba'im lidei himutz. You cannot make matzah from those things like rice, nor can they become hametz. U'mutar la'asot mehem tafshir, and you are allowed to cook them on Pesach. V'chen b'chol minei kitniyot, and this is true for all manner of kitniyot, which includes lentils and beans, etc. And then he adds, V'yesh oserim lechol orez v'chol minei kitniyot b'tavshil. There are those who say that it is forbidden to eat rice or other types of kitniyot that were cooked on Pesach. Lefi sheminei hitim mit'arvim bahem. Why? Not because they are hametz, but because sometimes you buy a kilo of rice, there'll be some grains of wheat mixed in with the rice by mistake. Lefi sheminei hitim mit'arvim bahem. That's the reason that he gives for those who claim that they do not eat these foods on Pesach. What is a Tur who's an Ashkenazi? Again, what does he say? Humra yetherahi. This is an extreme and unjustified humra. It is not something that people do. It's not even. He doesn't say the Ashkenazim do it, but we don't do it here in Spain. He doesn't say the Ashkenazim do it, because when he wants to tell you that in Ashkenaz is a certain minhag or a certain psak halacha, he tells you. He says b'Ashkenaz nagu kach v'kach. He doesn't say that. He says lo nagu ken. It's not the common practice, which means that when he wrote these words, which is in the late 14th century or mid 14th century. It was not, at that point, a common practice even amongst the Ashkenazim. That's why I say it can only really have become something that took hold at some time in the 15th century, apparently, because by the mid-15th century, we really do see certain posakim, like the Maharil, mention this minhag as something which is already common and widespread. Now, it's important to note that the reason given by the Tur for this minhag is not that, well, we're not sure whether the halacha is like Rabbi Yohanan ben Nuri or not, whether rice can become chametz or cannot become chametz. There's no mention of that at all, no such talk at all. We know that's not the case. It cannot become chametz. The reason that some people claim you should not eat rice on Pesach is because it may be the case, because of the possibility, even maybe a remote possibility, although in those days I think it was perhaps not nearly as remote as it is today, because frankly today I think if you buy rice you will not find a grain of wheat there at all. But this has to do with where the rice and the wheat come from and how they're packaged and processed, the different plants. It used to be the case in Israel also 40, 50 years ago, and I heard Rav Yaakov Yosef Zetzal say this in a shiur of his, that many decades ago it may have happened very rarely that you might find a grain of wheat in a packet of rice. Even then they look quite different, very different in fact, and just by going through the rice quickly you will find it, as you have to do anyhow, just to make sure there are no bugs or what have you, or pebbles or whatever else you may find in a packet of rice. But nowadays I frankly do not think that you will find anything at all. I have not seen anything, I think not even once in the last 30 years. I don't think I've seen a single grain of anything in rice that wasn't rice. And as I say, I also heard Rav Yaakov Yosef, who was familiar with these things, make this claim. And he was not the kind of person to make such claims lightly. The reason being given, therefore, here is that it's possible that certain grains, such as wheat, barley, which are asur on Pesach, if you cook them, will be in the rice that you bought and which you will now cook in your pot, and you'll end up eating a small amount of chametz that'll be mixed up with your rice. That's the reason given. Okay, that's one reason, which is only one of two major reasons that we find in the Rishonim for this minhag, and that's what I want to point out, because this is the main reason that most people are familiar with. Most people think this is the reason for the minhag. I believe that that's actually not the main reason for the minhag. The main reason is something else, but we'll get to that presently. Number 4, the last source on page number 1, is from the Beth Yosef, who is quoting Rabbeinu Yeruham. Rabbeinu Yeruham, as we know, was from the Provence, the south of France. He also studied in Spain. He also studied under the Rosh. And he writes in his Sefer, well-known book that the Poskim quote all the time, he writes at the end of the first line, Gam Rabbeinu Yeruham Katav, regarding what the Torah said, that it's a humra yethera, it's an unnecessary humra, שאותם שנהגו שלא לאכול אורז ומיני קטניות מבושל בפסח, those who hold this practice of not eating these things on Pesach, מנהג שטות הוא. He uses very strong, unequivocal language. He says, minhag shtuthu, which means it is a foolish, foolhardy minhag. It is based on nothing but error, or it makes no sense at all. That's what Rabbeinu Yeruham says. It's a minhag shtuth, and therefore not to be taken seriously. Zulathi imhem osim lahmir atzmam v'lo yadati lama. Unless their intention is somehow to be mahmir on themselves, and I don't know why they would do such a thing. That's what Rabbeinu Yeruham says. It is unusual to find one of the Rishonim refer to a minhag in those terms, as minhag shtuth. It's just something foolish and without any basis. So it's something to take note of when we find it here in this case. Now we can go on to page 2. Is there a clock? Ah, there it is. Okay. Source number 5. This is from the Oz Zarua, an Ashkenazi posek, and he's quoting here another Ashkenazi posek, Rabbeinu Shmuel Miplaiza. And he writes, Uvashiltot Rabbi, this is from the early period of the Gaonim, so this goes back approximately over 1,300 years. Masati katuv b'sof Hilchot Pesach v'chol minei kitnit mutar levashel ben b'Pesach ben b'shai yamim tovim. It is mutar to cook all manner of kitniyot on Pesach or other yamim tovim. And he quotes also the Rambam, who says the same thing. And then he goes on to say, even though all of this is correct in my eyes, v'afki be'enai hadvarim nechonim v'minhag shenahagu avotenu mehamath ta'uth, even though all of these statements of the Shiltot, of the Rambam, that these other types of food cannot become hametz, is correct in my view, and the minhag that our forefathers, in his place apparently was already a practice not to eat some of these types of kitniyot. This mistake is a practice based on ta'uth, he says, mehamath ta'uth, based on a mistake, an error, which is also an unusual statement, not something that you find frequently said. And therefore it's not something that one has to maintain is asur. Nevertheless, but one shouldn't eat these things in front of those who don't eat them in order not to cause mahloket, etc. Okay. So we see these two interesting statements from two well-known, very highly regarded poskim from the Middle Ages. One says it's a minhag shtuth, that's Rabbeinu Yeruham. The other says, Rabbeinu Shmuel Miplaiz, that this is a minhag based on ta'uth, on mistake, on error. This is a very important point, which we will speak about again in a moment. Because if you now ask yourself, so what is the mistake? What does he mean it's a minhag based on a mistake, on an error? What's the error? If the reason given was that sometimes you will find grains of wheat mixed up in the rice, so what's the error? It's not a question of error, it's a question of, do we take such a possibility into account or do we not? But where's the error? Where's the mistake? The answer to this question we find in source number 6 before us. This is the Hidushim on Masechet Pesachim, written by Rabbeinu Moshe Halawa. He was a Sfaradi from Spain. He was a Talmid of the Rashba. And he writes something very interesting. He says, Hane en orez v'do lo. So the Talmud told us these varieties of grain can become hametz, but not rice and not millet. He writes, V'chachmei Sorfatim amaru, but the Chachamim in Sorfat in France say, they claim that it's dafka these two orez and dohan, rice and millet, that cannot become chametz, but other types of legumes, such as lentils or what have you, might become chametz. And then it goes on to say, Uchlal nathanula divrehem. Kol shenitpah b'vishulo, anything which literally puffs up or expands when it is cooked, asur levashelo b'Pesach, may not be cooked on Pesach. Diksat hames yeshbo, because even though it's not real fully fledged hametz, it's a kind of secondary hametz. And then he goes on to reject this statement. He says, "Waha letha," and he explains why he rejects this statement altogether. This is a very, very unusual statement, which has to be understood. There are many, many foodstuffs that when you soak them in water, they will expand. Correct? And why is that? Because they absorb water. By sitting in water for a certain length of time, they absorb water, and therefore they begin to expand in volume. It has nothing to do with chimutz. It has to do with the fact that some of that water ended up inside this substance. So it could be rice, which might expand if it's soaked in water for a time. It certainly is true of things like chickpeas, beans, lentils, etc. If you soak them in water long enough, they will absorb some of that water at least, and therefore will expand somewhat. So the actual fact of expansion or increase in size or volume has nothing to do with hametz. It has to do with the water. But what you do hear here is the claim, very unusual claim, very surprising claim, that certain things like rice, and the same again is true of chickpeas or lentils or beans, when you cook them in water, first you soak them usually, but especially when you cook them, they expand. That's true, that's a fact, correct? Beans that you buy dry beans and you soak them and you cook them, they expand. When it gets to your plate, it's more or less doubled in size, correct? The actual bean or the lentil. Now that is in some way reminiscent of what happens when you make bread, when you make dough. You take flour and water, you mix them together, and what happens? Eventually they begin to rise, they begin to expand, as we explained. In order for this to happen, you usually use either sourdough or commercial dough, or commercial yeast that we have today. The ancient method is to use sourdough. But it can even happen to a limited extent without any additional yeast at all, because there are natural yeasts in the air which are attracted and stick to the dough if it's sitting around outside long enough, and it might become chametz even without any additional yeast. So, and then it begins to rise. So there's a very vague but nevertheless similarity, you could say, between a dough that rises and expands in size and other substances like beans or what have you that you soak in water and cook in water, and they also expand in size. So it seems that for some reason some people thought that this expands or this expands, well, that means it's like chametz, or it's similar to chametz. It may not be fully blown chametz, but it's some kind of second rate or a minor form of chametz. That's what we're hearing. That's what we hear here in this statement of Maharam Halawa, in the name of Chachamim from Tzorfat, from France. And I want you to note that this is a very different statement from what the Tur, who was not from France but originally from Germany and then was in Spain, that's very different from what the Tur wrote. He said the reason that some people do not eat these foods, these kitniyot on Pesach, he didn't say anything about rising or being similar to chametz in any way. He just said some of those grains that you're not allowed to cook on Pesach may be mixed up with the things that you can cook on Pesach. So you may have some barley mixed up with your beans or some wheat mixed up with your rice, and therefore don't cook rice on Pesach, because you may end up eating some wheat grains together with the rice. But there was never the suggestion, even for a moment, that rice or beans or anything like that could in any way be considered chametz, even in a minor form of chametz. But this statement here, in the name of Chachmet Tzorfat, the Chachamim in France, tells us something quite different. That they regarded things that become swell and increase in size when cooked, like Kitniyot, to be a minor form of chametz. They agree it's not real, full-blown chametz. So if you ate it on Pesach, you're not chayav for eating chametz on Pesach, but it's not to be regarded as zero chametz altogether. It's not chametz-free completely. And that is a very surprising statement, but it's a fact. It's right. It's written here explicitly, and this same statement appears in a few other places. That, and therefore, we must therefore reach the conclusion that there are actually two reasons, or two rationales for not eating these types of food, rice, legumes, on Pesach. According to one explanation, which is rooted in Ashkenaz in Germany, there was a hashash, there was the possibility that certain grains that you're not allowed to cook on Pesach would get mixed up with those things you can cook on Pesach. By the way, parenthetically, this has to do almost certainly with the triennial system of agriculture that was put in place in medieval Europe, in those countries like Germany and France as well, around the 9th century or the 10th century, when they did a rotation of crops. And this meant that the year before, the season before you grew this let's say you grew legumes, you grew beans in the field this year. Last year, or the last season, you grew wheat in that same field, in that plot of land. And we know that what happens from season to season is that some grains are lost along the way, and they fall into the ground, and they sprout up later. So when you come to harvest your legumes, you end up harvesting perhaps some of these grains that grew here and there in the field as well, these grains of wheat. That is possibly the reason for this being considered a possibility that had to be taken into account. The other explanation that is mentioned here by Maram Halua in the name of the Chachmet Tzorfat, and we also find this in another book written by Rabbeinu Asher Milunel, Sefer Minharot. He mentions the same thing. The idea there is that these things are a secondary or minor form of chametz. They're not real chametz, but nevertheless you don't eat them on Pesach because they're similar to chametz, or they are to be regarded as a minor type of chametz. That is something which is even more surprising than the first explanation, because it contradicts completely that which the Mishnah told us, and which the Talmud told us, that it's only these particular grains that can become chametz, and nothing else. And that's why we find in number 7, Halachot Kesuvot, which is an ancient work going back about 1300 years. It says, B'chol minei kitnit mutar b'Pesach u'v'yomim tovim. And in the wake of all of this, we find in Rabbeinu Manoach, who is a Rishon also from Provence, from the south of France, and he was familiar with this practice, or this minhag. And he says in his Perush on the Rambam, he says, "Wa'en safek," number 8, she'im rasa lechol zeronim b'Pesach, if your person wishes to eat kitniyot on Pesach, v'chayotze ba'ele, or chayotze b'hem, b'shari minei kitnit mutar, you're allowed to do so. Wa'en bazeh hashash isur klal, there is no possible halachic problem with this. Wa'af al pi shenaru, even though there are those who have a practice not to do so. And why does he say this? Why does he say that you do not have to take this minhag into account? Deha amrena b'Yerushalmi perek makom shenagu. It says in the Talmud Yerushalmi, Masechet Pesachim, Kol davar shemutar u'to'eh bo be'isur nish'al u'matirim lo. In other words, if a minhag exists, but it is based on a misconception, a mistake, a ta'uth, and this is what we saw earlier in number 5, right? That Rabbeinu Shmuel wrote that I think this minhag is based on a ta'uth, and Rabbeinu Yeruham said it's a minhag shtuth, it's folly, it's not correct, it's total nonsense. When a minhag is based on a misconception or a misunderstanding of the halacha, it does not have the halachic status of a minhag, which you have to take seriously. It's to be regarded as a mistake. And if you go and ask your local rabbi, and he'll tell you you're allowed to drop that minhag. That's what it says in the Yerushalmi. That's what he's quoting here. The last source I'm going to quote with regards to these halachic sources for this evening is number 9. This is from the Gra, the Gaon of Vilna, the Gaon Rabbeinu Eliyahu of Vilna. We all know that the Gra not only intended to come to Eretz Yisrael, he actually left Vilna and was on the road to come to Eretz Yisrael, and he turned back. The reasons as to why he turned back have been discussed for the last 250 or 230 odd years, and we won't go into that now, but it is a fact that he wanted to come and he didn't end up coming to Eretz Yisrael. And what we find in a certain source which relates many things regarding the Gra, it says as follows: Shamati mi'arav Yaakov Kahana sheshama hadvarim kazo yotzim mipi admor hasid. In other words, Rabbi Yaakov Kahana knew the Gra personally, and he says that I heard the Gra say the following: Lu yiten li she'ezkel hashevet be'eretz hakodesh. I hope that Hashem will mezakeh oti, will allow me to the zchut of coming to Eretz Yisrael. Uchadai huli, and it is worth coming here, if only for the following reason: that I should be able to relinquish and drop the minhagim. Polish literally means Poland. In other words, these practices that are certain practices that are common here in this part of the world, and the Grad was not necessarily an almond of all minhagim and practices that existed in his time and his place. He says if it's difficult to change one's practice when is living within these communities, but if I was to move to Eretz Yisrael, I would definitely drop some of these minhagim, which already introduces the idea that when one changes one's locality, in other words, it's true there were many Jews, most Jews, Ashkenazi Jews in Chutz La'aretz, in Europe, did not eat Kitniyot on Pesach, but that is, minhag is always connected to a locale, to a place. But if you move away from that place, you go to another place where such a minhag is not the standard practice, you are not required to maintain that practice any longer. And that's precisely what the Gra said. The Gra said, if I move to Eretz Yisrael, I won't have to do all of these minhagim. So that's a general and relatively brief overview of the halachic sources with regards to this minhag. In fact, if one looks in the Ashkenazi Rishonim, in the medieval times, amongst the classic halachic authorities, you will find that almost none of the Ashkenazi Rishonim were in favor of this minhag. It's a strange thing. You find so many people doing it today saying that's the minhag of our forefathers, but you go back 700, 800, 700, 600 years, and you see that everyone's opposed. The Rosh said you're allowed to do it. The Torah said you're allowed to eat rice. The Mordechai, is the same period, also says the same thing. We know we have clear evidence and statements to the effect that Rabbeinu Yehiel mi Paris and Rabbeinu Yehuda mi Paris, two of the greatest Chachamim in Tzorfat, in France, the place where we're told that some people thought it was a kind of chametz, that they ate beans on Pesach, etc., etc. It's very difficult to find anyone who was in favor of this minhag at all. Strangely, somehow, it did take off at some point, and it's quite surprising, but that is a fact. It's also a fact that almost all the halachic authorities who specifically related to it said that it's not to be taken into account, not to be taken seriously. Now, a person could well ask, all right, we understand, the sources tell us that it's mutar completely, without question, to eat all these foods on Pesach. But what's the big deal? If you not to eat rice, not to eat kitniyot, not to eat lentils for 7 days. What's the big deal? Well, I would tell you a number of things. I'll go from the minakal el kaved, from the more minor reasons to the more serious reasons. The more minor reason is that in places in Chutz La'aretz, such as North America, for example, where almost all the Jews are Ashkenazi, there were many, many products available on Pesach that were Kitniyot free. And when I say kitniyot free, we're not talking about kitniyot, we're not about rice, and we're not talking about soybeans. We're talking about derivatives of these foods. In other words, oils from things which can be considered kitniyot. That's also a separate story, by the way. What is considered kitniyot? For example, I'll explain. Are peanuts to be considered kitniyot? What do you say? Any idea?
Not if you're German. No, I grew up on peanut oil. That was
All right, so there you go. Where did you grow up?
in Cleveland.
There you go.
Yeah,
This I happen to know for a fact from people who grew up at that period in various places in North America, that the oil that everybody used on Pesach till well into the 1960s apparently was peanut oil, and no one thought it was kitniyot. It wasn't considered a kitnit. All of a sudden, at some time in the 1960s, there are various stories about how this happened. I won't go into all the details now, but I've heard some interesting things related to me. Somehow, peanuts which were never kitniyot became kitniyot, and therefore that means peanut oil is not good. So you have to now come up with a substitute for peanut oil. And what is a substitute for peanut oil? Well, walnut oil, for example, which just happens to cost 5 times, 6 times as much. And it just happens, perhaps, I'll leave that to your imagination, that certain people produce it, had a vested interest in people being of the opinion that they had to buy their walnut oil for Pesach. If I tell you that there were certain Satmar Hasidim involved in the production of walnut oil beginning of the 1960s, perhaps you begin to get the picture. I'll leave the rest to your imagination. That's not just a story, okay? I can tell you more than that. When I was 22 years old, exactly this time of year, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, I just got married. I was a young Avrech in Mekaz Arav. After Tfilat Shaharit, I walked up to Gaon of Shaul Yisraeli, Zecher Tzedek Livracha, and I asked him several questions to do with Pesach. And I asked him about Kitniyot and what was his opinion on the matter. And his opinion was, he says, well, I don't need Kitniyot on Pesach, but I can tell you that many of the things that are today considered Kitniyot, in my day, they weren't considered Kitniyot. Rav Yisraeli came from the town, or city, I'm not quite sure, I haven't really looked it up how large it was, but it's a place called Slutsk in Russia. A well-known town where there were many Chachamim. Gaon Rabbi Yisrael Meltzer, the author of Even HaEzer, who was here in Yerushalayim, later was also from Slutsk, and he was the Rav of the town of Slutsk when Rav Yisraeli was a teenager or something like that. And he said to me, I remember, he said to me, in Slutsk, the thing that people put on the table when guests came to visit on Pesach was peanuts. And he said, I saw this in the home of Rav Yisrael Meltzer Tzal. I was there, I saw it. Everyone was eating peanuts. No one thought it was kitniyot at all. Today, most Ashkenazim would say, oh, peanuts, it's kitniyot, we don't, something like that. No one knows exactly how or why, but that's what happened. It became kitniyot. And the same is true of many other things. Further, I will tell you that many derivatives which are used in processed foods, such as lecithin, are derivatives of soybeans, for example. So you're not really eating a kitnit, but you're eating a derivative of something which is somehow or other, by way of an interesting process, is produced, which is used by manufacturers for various reasons. So it's not really kitniyot, but it's a kitniyot derivative. Now these kinds of substances are found in many, many foodstuffs. So as soon as you decide that you're not going to consume such things on Pesach, you have to remove a tremendous number of things from the menu. And in Israel, that's much more complicated than it is in other places. As I said, in countries where no one wanted to eat things to do with kitniyot, so some substitute was found and it was readily available. But in Israel today, that's not so much the case. Someone actually who lives here in Efrat, who's lived here for 20 years, a man in his early 50s, he said to me that, I've noticed a big difference here in Efrat, he said. He said, when I first came here, Most of the people who moved to Efrat originally from the United States were older than me, and they were used to not eating Kitniyot on Pesach. So here in the stores in Efrat, you also always had these imported foods from the US. In the stores in Efrat, everyone was used to eating these things on Pesach, and people bought them. But he said, now I look around, all these people's children who grew up here, things like bamba and bisli and all sorts of things that are kasher Pesach, but they may have some Kitniyot oil or some such thing in them. He says that everyone's buying them. Their children are no longer into this. They just drop that practice altogether. He said it's just a sociological, historical fact, but that's what's happening. That the second generation of Ashkenazi immigrants to places like Efrat, he says, are just not interested in maintaining this practice, which I think is probably a inexorable and inevitable process, because you have in the country here today, we have 50% Ashkenazim, 50% Sfaradim, actually more Sfaradim than Ashkenazim. So there's much less demand and there's much less need for these kinds of products. And these things eventually result in a new reality. And that's, I think, what's happening. But these are all relatively minor reasons. Because, if you really don't want to eat rice on Pesach, you can certainly get away without eating rice on Pesach. And you don't have to buy that particular snack food or what have you, which happens to have some kind of oil in it. You can certainly survive 7 days without these things. Whether your children or grandchildren will survive, I am not sure, but you'll probably survive. But that's not the essential reason. The essential reason, in my view, is a psychological one, not an halachic one. The psychology of it works as follows. Are we looking backwards or are we looking forwards? If you're looking backwards, what was done in the various communities from which our forebears came in Europe, and you say, well, whatever they did, we have to do as well. Well then, if you know that we're not eating Kitniyot, so you won't eat Kitniyot. And that's understandable. Maybe even something to be respected. Because after all, minhag, custom, tradition has a very important place in the Torah. No question. On the other hand, we are in a new reality, in a new historical period. Should we be looking backwards or should we be looking forwards? When I say forwards, I mean thinking in terms of a Bet Mikdash, a Corban Pesach, Malchut Beth David, the Sanhedrin, etc., etc. Specifically, Corban Pesach. Let's talk about a Corban Pesach. Corban Pesach is a chovah. There's no way of getting out of that. It just is. Okay? And I do not know of any serious person who thinks otherwise. But psychologically, Kitniyot, not eating Kitniyot, and having a Corban Pesach don't go together. Because that kind of Judaism, that form of Judaism, that kind of Jewish existence that existed in Dvinsk, Pinsk, or Minsk, or in Hungary, or what have you, there you had no Korban Pesach, and it wasn't even an option. You can't bring a Korban Pesach in Hungary or in Poland, but in Eretz Yisrael you certainly can, and you should, you must. If you are constantly thinking in terms of the old country, what was done 2, 3, 4, even 10 generations ago, then you cannot really be thinking in terms of what should be tomorrow and what should be in 10, 20, or 200 years from now. Psychologically, these things don't work. Now, you may say, as a certain professor of Hebrew literature who's very much in favor of the Mikdash and the Korban Pesach, someone I've known for many years, you may say to me, as he once said to me in a conversation that we were having about this, I said, look, if you want Korban Pesach, and I know that you do, you and all the people that you speak to and have influence over, you have to drop the minhag of Kitniyot because these things don't go together. And he said to me, that's not true. He said, look at me, I don't eat Kitniyot on Pesach and I want a Korban Pesach. And I said, that's because you're you. You're a particular kind of person, that's your brand. You're known for being that kind of guy, the guy who doesn't eat Kitniyot but does want a Korban Pesach. That's why you're famous, okay? And that's true, by the way. I'm not going to mention his name, but that's part of his image, that's part of his media image. And he is known, okay? But most people don't work that way. Most people either relate to that form of Judaism, or they think in terms of that type of Judaism. They either aspire to that, or they want to maintain what was, or they don't want to change anything. If you're stuck in that rut of let's just do what was done up until now, there is nothing new under the sun, and there won't be, and there cannot be anything new under the sun. That's the thinking behind that frame of mind. Then, okay, you can maintain what was, but you will not be able to change and move towards something better and different, and something which is actually required. In order to do that, you have to break out of that mold, out of that mold of viewing yourself as an Ashkenazi Jew. If you consider yourself to be an Ashkenazi Jew, well, then you haven't got much of a choice. Or most people don't think they have much of a choice if they consider themselves to be Ashkenazi Jews. But if you consider yourself to be a Jew living in Eretz Yisrael, well, that's something very different. I'm no longer Ashkenazi, nor am I Sfaradi. I'm just a Jew in Eretz Yisrael. So what does a Jew in Eretz Yisrael do? Well, a Jew in Eretz Yisrael does A, B, C, and D, and one of the things he does is he wants a Corban Pesach, and he is serious about it. But if you're thinking in terms of being an Ashkenazi Jew, or for that matter a Sfaradi Jew or Temani Jew, it doesn't matter. If you're completely focused on that particular mindset and that particular historical reality, and you view yourself as one more link in that chain, which cannot be changed or improved upon, then what you end up with is what we find today. That many Jews will pay lip service to a Corban Pesach, but really they don't relate to it. They can't relate to it. They have no real interest in it. And frankly, no one can hear us now, right? So between you and me, they're happy that it is so. They're relieved they don't have to worry about a Corban Pesach. It's just not something they're used to doing, because then how are you going to invite your grandchildren? How are you going to make a Seder at home? You have to be in Yerushalayim. and you have to everything, the whole world has to change to make that possible, correct? All of us will have to be in Yerushalayim. They have to change the whole city of Yerushalayim for this, by the way. And there are people who've very written about this. People know about city planning, etc. I mean, the whole of the old city will have to be remade. Totally. It'll have to be basically flattened and begun again. You'll have to have huge underground rapid transport trains bringing huge numbers of people to Har HaBayit. You'll have to have the palace of Malchut Beit David over here and the Sanhedrin over here, and you'll have to have the Mikdash over here in the middle. And it's going to be a huge operation. That couldn't possibly work as things are today. I mean, just today, just getting to Rami Levi and back was such an ordeal. I almost didn't get here in time, right? So how could it possibly work in Yerushalayim with millions of Jews? Obviously, this is something that we have to think about seriously. But no one's going to think about it seriously if you're a Hungarian Jew or a Polish Jew or a Russian Jew. Then there's nothing to think about. We just do what we did in Hungary or Poland and Russia, which is okay if you're in Russia or Poland or Hungary. But it's not okay at all if you're in Yerushalayim, or if you're in Gush Etzion, or if you're in Tel Aviv, or anywhere else in Eretz Yisrael. So it's all about where we are today and where we would like to be in the future. And are we looking backwards, or are we looking ahead? And that, I think, is the most fundamental and cogent argument for dropping the minhag of Kitniyot, apart from all the clear-cut halachic texts and proofs that we cited. There's no question that it's a minhag based on some kind of error, as explicitly mentioned by a number of Rishonim. But beyond that, it's one more thing that is holding us back from being who we should be and going where we need to go. And with that, I'll leave you with that, and you can mull over these things and make of it, and ponder these things from now till Pesach. And who knows? Maybe you'll change if you have adopted a certain practice or followed a certain practice till now. Maybe you'll change your mind, and perhaps you won't. And that's up to you. If there are some questions, bevakasha. Yes.
I have a question.
Did I misunderstand? You mentioned salt in connection with making matzah.
Yeah.
I didn't have my hearing aid adjusted right now. I wasn't sure.
The general practice is not to add salt to the dough from which matzot are made. This idea appears in some sources amongst the Rishonim. The claim being that we don't know, no one says they know that it causes the dough to increase the likelihood or the pace of the process of fermentation of chimut, but they say maybe it does, we don't know, so therefore we won't put salt in. First of all, there are also a number of Rishonim who say the opposite, that obviously you're allowed to put salt in matzah, just as you put salt in bread. Anyone who makes bread, or has tasted bread made without salt, knows that it's essentially tasteless without salt. Salt is an essential ingredient in the making of bread, or matzah. Matzah is also bread, it's just unleavened bread. Second of all, anyone who knows anything about baking bread, and I happen to be a baker, I bake sourdough bread at home all the time. I've also been baking soft matzot in my kitchen for nearly 40 years now. When I say soft, I mean you can roll them up and make a real korech. You can actually roll the korech and it doesn't break in your hands. You can't do that with brittle matzah. And it's very tasty, and it's fresh, and it's wonderful. So I know a little bit about baking. In fact, I ended up baking bread, which I only began doing perhaps 10 years ago, because I've been baking matzah for 30 years before that. So I figured if I can bake matzah, no reason I can't bake bread. And that's how it happened. So the fact is that salt, not only does it not speed up the process of chimutz, of fermentation, it slows it down. This is known to anyone who knows anything at all about baking. And it's so obvious when you know it, when you've tried it, when it's something that you see and do with your own hands and you see with your own eyes, that it really is surprising that anyone would think otherwise. Any real baker will tell you that you have to add salt at a certain point to the dough, otherwise it'll rise too quickly or too much, and it'll become have too sour a flavor, etc. The salt doesn't stop the process, it slows it down, and it maintains it at an even keel, in a manner that can be handled and is beneficial. So actually adding salt is, if anything, is going to slow the process of possible chimutz, is going to slow it down. So I do add salt to my matzah, and of course it comes out much tastier as well, that goes without saying. And my recommendation to those who wish to bake their own matzah and learn how to do it is that they do that. They try doing this, and you will discover that the result is, if you know what you're doing, and you do have to learn how to do it and see someone who has done it before show you how to do it. It is a very rewarding and also tasty exercise. Yes, you had a question
about the oats. If oats is not one of the
Yes.
5 grains, then you can just eat it.
All right, well, I would say to that, a typical Jewish answer, yes and no. Halachically, mi'ikar hadin, I think the answer is yes. It's definitely not chametz, and you can make porridge on Pesach and eat it. But, seeing that Rashi and certain other poskim, many based on Rashi, are of the opinion that oats are one of these 5 species and are to be considered chametz if you cook them in water on Pesach, I would not recommend doing so. I do not do so, and I would not recommend that anyone does so, even though I'm convinced that it's not chametz. But I would not make porridge on Pesach.
If you don't cook them, but just because I never cook them, I just leave them to swallow a little bit. Because
you take oats and you just eat them as they are.
In milk and coconut milk or water, and just leave it for overnight so that you can eat it.
Well, again, I'm convinced that mitzad halacha it's mutar. It's mutar and it's not chametz at all. But Rashi would tell you that you can't do that. And when it comes to Pesach, I think and when it comes to Rashi, we should never, despite the fact that we're not convinced that it is so, we should refrain from doing so on Pesach. All right?
So no one would have, so you, in your opinion, there's no mitzvah of eating matzah made from oats on Pesach?
I don't think so. No. From different kinds of wheat, from spelt. You could also be from barley, although I think is very different. You could make it from barley. I haven't seen such matzah, but you could do so. What else? We said rye. You could also do it from rye. If you, just as wheat can become chametz, but you make matzah in such a way that doesn't become chametz, you can also do the same with rye. So those are your options. Yeah. I myself prefer spelt, so I use spelt. Yes.
Do you have any tips on navigating the family situation if you're going to start?
Well, B, can you elaborate? What's the problem?
So, if our kids come to us or whatever,
Right. Okay.
they don't eat kids.
And they don't want kitniyot, and you do?
Keep it
Well,
popular, or-
There's no mitzvah to eat kitniyot on Pesach. You're not chayav to eat kitniyot on Pesach. So if it makes your guests or your family feel uncomfortable, you don't have to do it at that meal. So it's not a big deal.
But some people consider if you cooked it in a pot like it's chametz, or that's just nourishment.
No one, no reasonable person would say such a thing. No.
I have an opposite, but if I don't eat kitniyot, my kids eat kitniyot, can I serve them kitniyot?
They do eat kitniyot. So why would you not serve it to them?
Because I don't.
Because you have to cook it for them? Well, that's
I
up to
have
you.
a pot- No, I have a special pot for kitniyot,
If you want to. It's up to you.
but it's not a problem.
You're the chef, you're the boss. It's your kitchen.
Yeah.
Do what you like. All right. We'll leave it at that. Question, yes?
Putting aside Kitniyot for a moment, say,
Yes.
I always want to bring Corban Pesach. Obviously, there are other political problems with that, but is there a place we can start?
Any Corban, including Corban Pesach, can only be brought on Harabait. At minimum, we need a Mizbeach built in the correct spot on Harabait. That is not a complicated thing to achieve. It would only take a few days to build a Mizbeach on the right spot in Harabait at the most. But without that, you cannot make a Corban Pesach. You cannot bring a Corban Pesach anywhere else on earth outside Harabait. That's the halacha, no question, no debate. So the reason, if you ask, so why are we not bringing a Corban Pesach, is very simple. It's called the Israeli government, it's called the Israeli police force, it's called the Arabs, it's called all kinds of things. There are also lots of Jews, of course, who would do anything to prevent us from bringing a Corban Pesach. I just happened to have read in the newspaper the other day that in the dormitories of Bar-Ilan University, apparently, recently, a sheep or a lamb was slaughtered. Now, there's no problem with that. I'm sure all of us here, or most of us here, eat meat at least some of the time, and we've all eaten meat from a sheep or a lamb on many occasions. And the slaughtering of a sheep it's not a big deal. Nothing to get excited about, unless, of course, it has something to do with Judaism. In which case, it's absolutely verboten. It's asur. It cannot happen. So word got out. Now, why was this sheep slaughtered? It wasn't in fact anything to do with Corban Pesach. There also, by the way, there are every year a couple of places in the country where people do a kind of mock Corban Pesach just to show people what it would be like, something like that. Okay, but this was not the case. In this particular case, in Bar-Ilan University, this was a course for students from overseas, and they had been studying things to do with shechita, with halachic slaughtering of animals, and they wanted to show them how it's done and how the animal is dead in a second and all what have you. They wanted to see how it is in practice. So they brought a sheep and they slaughtered it. But because it had to do with teaching Torah and explaining the Torah to people, this caused a huge ruckus and a scandal with various politicians, as I read the other day in the paper. Of course, those very same people, having made their statement to the press about how terrible it is that a sheep was slaughtered for this supposed ritual purpose, it wasn't actually a ritual purpose, it was just slaughtered. People saw how it was done, saw what shechita is, how it's done, and then they ate the meat of the sheep just like Everybody else does. Those same people who wrote against it, of course, that very evening went out to a restaurant and had lamb chops, without a doubt, no question. But if Jews do it for anything to do with Torah, it's of course a terrible thing. This is why we don't have a Corban Pesach. There's no halachic reason we don't have a Corban Pesach. That's a separate shiur, not for today, but that's the bottom line. There is no halachic reason that we do not have a Corban Pesach today. It's not because of Tum'at Meth, which is Hutra B'tzibur. It's not because we don't know, we can't make Mizbeach in the right place. It's not because of not having the tzitz for the Kohen HaGadol. All these, and not having Techeret, which we do have today. All these things were mentioned by Poskim already 200 plus years ago, such as in an exchange between the Chatham Sofer and Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger asked the Chatham Sofer, if the Turkish Sultan were to permit it, would we be able to bring a Korban Pesach? This correspondence went on over 200 years ago. And what did the Chatham Sofer write back? He said to him, and this by the way teaches you something about Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was a couple of years older than the Chatham Sofer, and everybody knew he was the Gadol Ador, or one of the Gadolei Ador, and he writes to his son-in-law, because the Chatham Sofer married in his second marriage after his wife passed away, married a widowed daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, so it was also his son-in-law. But he was very, very humble and modest, and he asked the Chatham Sofer, what do you think about this? And he wrote back to him and said, he went through all the points that we mentioned, Tcheret, Kohen Gadol, Yichus Kohanim, Tumat Mer. He says, all of these reasons do not apply. There's nothing halachic here. There's no reason that applies that prevents us from doing it. So if the Sultan says yes, we can go and do it. This was 200 plus years ago. So all we've really achieved so far is that we've replaced the Sultan with a certain individual from Ra'anana. But we'll leave it at that for now. Okay? Shalom, shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.